Good evening. My name is Noel Lateef. I'm president of the Foreign Policy Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special panel that we have this evening, a discussion commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and the emergence of a new global order. This lecture series owes its existence to the generous support of the John B. Herford Foundation. And I'm delighted that the director of the foundation, Jane Kurzman, is with us this evening. John was a Haverford College alumnus, not to be confused with Harvard, Haverford, an investment advisor and longtime FPA director. His enduring commitment to international engagement through the Herford Foundation continues to inspire thoughtful discussions. This evening's discussion will explore the war's aftermath and the creation of the post-war global order, topics that remain deeply relevant as we navigate today's shifting geopolitical landscape. This is an important milestone, and we commemorate the great men and women who sacrificed and worked to create this new system of governance. Individuals like Dean Acheson, who gave his autobiography the title Present at the Creation. We are honored to be joined by three distinguished speakers. Serving as moderator, Adam Howard, the distinguished historian at the U.S. Department of State, Stephen Schlesinger, fellow at the Century Foundation, and author of the definitive history of the founding of the United Nations, and Julian Zelizer, Malcolm Forbes Professor of History at Princeton, New York Times bestselling author, and publisher of the insightful Substack newsletter, The Long View. I really encourage you to subscribe. A great, great Substack. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name, as Noel said, Adam Howard. I'm the historian for the Department of State. I'm also an adjunct professor of history at George Washington University. If you'll indulge me for one moment before we go further, I just want to mention something about the work we do, because in the various topics that are going to come up tonight that both Julian and Steve are going to talk about, if you are interested, you can look at the original sources and the documents that we have on our website, history.state.gov. They're all available for free, fully searchable. The series runs from 1861 all the way through the end of the 20th century and will continue on. So I do encourage you to take advantage of this rich documentation that a lot of people don't realize exists, but it is there for anyone in the world to access. Now, I have to, before I go further, I have to provide a disclaimer, since I do work for the State Department, that all the views expressed by me this evening are my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. government. Fortunately, though, I'm a moderator this evening, so I'll simply be asking provocative questions, not having to answer them, so I'm going to leave to our distinguished panelists to get into the controversies and spare me. Let me say, first of all, it's an honor to be here, and it's really for a couple of reasons. First, I interned for the FPA in the summer of 1997 when its office was on Park Avenue and 28th, and it was a truly wonderful experience I still cherish. I still have very vivid memories from that summer. I'm also honored to share the stage with these two exceptional scholars as we mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, an event that didn't just redraw maps and topple empires, but also launched what came to be known as the American century. Now, whether that century is still going strong, nearing retirement, or due for a second act, that's one of the questions we'll explore together. To help us think it through, we're joined by two of the most insightful voices on the exercise of American power across the 20th and 21st centuries. These two gentlemen are prolific in what they've been able to produce, especially publications. They frankly put to shame the rest of us who can't keep up. In the case of Julian Zelizer, of course, Noel already did a very generous introduction. I just want to go a step further, that he has authored and edited 27 books, and includes the landmark studies such as The Fierce Urgency of Now, Burning Down the House, and most recently, just in January, In Defense of Partisanship. So Julian, welcome.
Thank you.
And then we have Stephen Schlesinger. He's a longtime figure at the intersection of journalism, diplomacy, and history. He served as the director of the World Policy Institute at the New School and publisher of the World Policy Journal. But earlier in his career, I was always fascinated. He was a staff writer at Time, editor of the New Democrat, which we talked about a little bit earlier tonight, and a speechwriter and foreign policy advisor to Governor Mario Cuomo for 12 years. He's also held senior role at the United Nations Habitat Program, and he's taught at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. In addition to that, he's published 3 books, The New Reformers, Bitter Fruit, and Act of Creation, which won the Harry S. Truman Book Award. So we've got really good speakers tonight who can speak to these questions. And so I am going to do my best to be disciplined with time because I want to give time for both the audience here and those online to be able to ask questions. So forgive me when I keep checking my watch to make sure we're not running past 7 o'clock before I start turning it over. So let's start the discussion right from the beginning, the end of World War II. In 1945, the United States emerged from World War II uniquely powerful. The US infrastructure was intact. For the rest of the world, this was clearly not the case. The US was going to maintain an atomic monopoly in terms of its weaponry all the way into the early 50s. Yes, the Soviets detonated their first bomb in 49, but they didn't have a delivery system until 1953. So for the United States, they are supremely powerful economically, militarily, and this is really the opening salvo for the questions tonight. So my questions are twofold to start. For both of you, how would you characterize the mindset of American leaders at that moment? And secondly, what were they trying to build, both at home but also abroad? So Julian, let me start with you, and then we'll give Stephen a chance.
I would say victorious, shattered, and scared, meaning I think the clarity of how the war ended and the defeat of fascism and totalitarianism felt complete at some level. There was a clarity that we wouldn't obviously have with Vietnam, with Korea. And I think American leaders understood this. They understood they were emerging as a superpower. I think all of that was clear. I think they were shattered in that, and we don't forget, but the cost of the war to the United States and within Europe became quickly apparent. And that was on their mind at the same time. I think that is part of what the conversation is of the post-war effort to achieve stability, never forgetting just how the war had ravaged human capital and obviously the infrastructure. And also they were kind of shattered. I think at some level, even though democracy was victorious, it was clear how tenuous it could be. And obviously we might come back to that issue. But here you had, for a while, a triumphant moment for non-democratic forces. And finally, scared, it didn't feel like the end of war. I mean, it did and it didn't. So the euphoria captured by the kiss in Times Square is one image, and the mushroom cloud is another. And we entered right into a period where very quickly we understood that the dangers that manifested themselves in World War II would continue in different forms, and in some ways in even more dangerous capacity. So I think all of this was operating on people's minds.
Great. Stephen?
Yeah, I would agree that the mood was grim at the end of the Second World War. You remember, for the First World War, it happened just 25 years earlier, before the Second World War began. First World War, 30 million people or so died. By the Second World War, 25 years later, almost 60 million people had died. So there was this frightening feeling among the states that had survived this second catastrophe. How can we prevent the outbreak of a third world war? And it was a furious response because, as you could see, the lives that had been lost were widespread, and the societies that were destroyed by the warfare were so self-evident that people turned in many ways to the American government, which is the only country which was really unaffected by the destruction of the Second World War, to Franklin Roosevelt, who had declared in 1941 about his 4 freedoms: the freedom from fear the freedom from hunger and you're getting me now. Get this out. Freedom from fear and Julian, do you remember?
I'm not going to remember.
I'm not going to. It will come back to me in a minute. Anyway, my point is that Roosevelt had been a symbol of the kind of idea that maybe out of these two catastrophes, these two great wars, something good could come out of it. And his idea was the idea of the United Nations. And many of the countries that had been destroyed by the war, but they were effectively in very distressed situations, very much responded to Roosevelt's call to formulate a new body which would replace the League of Nations. The League of Nations had been for 20 years the representative security body for the world, but it had failed. The United States never joined it, which meant that it was not it was basically a hollow organization if you didn't have one of the biggest powers on the globe as part of it. And Russia was eventually kicked out of it in 1939 when it invaded Finland. But Roosevelt had promised with the United Nations a new security organization which would guarantee that the possibility of a third world war could be prevented. Now, of course, the idea of a UN organization was not a world government, and so in many ways, this was not a force or an organization that could implement force unless you had the agreement of the 5 veto nations on the Security Council. But nonetheless, it was an aspirational idea, the UN Charter, which all the nations of the world could agree to about outlawing aggression against other nations, and at the same time making sure that sovereignty was part of the deal that would preserve the independence of states around the globe. So that idea of the UN was a positive that came out of these terrible conflicts. But as Julian was saying, you know, there was also this feeling of uncertainty. Where do we go next? At this point, the Soviet Union was becoming a precarious partner to the United States, and the whole issue of the future was still up in the air. But I think that nonetheless, the UN still represented a good force that came out of that conflict.
There was also, I'll just add one thing, and by the way, it's freedom of speech and expression, worship, freedom from one.
There you are.
Freedom from one.
He's the real historian.
But I mean, the other interesting thing, which is it complicates the story, there's been a bunch of books on this post kind of World War II to 1949 period, and there were a lot of American leaders ambivalent about expanding our role overseas, our national security infrastructure, and some of those older forms of resistance to government, to big government, and also fears of a garrison state was the term Senator Robert Taft would use, were very strong still. There's a book by Michael Hogan, a historian, who wrote about this. And I think it's just another layer of the complexities of that period.
Well, you've started to touch on institutions, so that's what I really want to get to in the next question. Both of you've written about institutions, whether it's Congress, the presidency, international bodies like the United Nations. Which of the post-war institutions fulfilled their original promise in your mind? And fair game too, which ones failed as far as you're concerned when it comes to that promise, and why? And I'll start with you, Julian, just like Stephen.
Yeah. I mean, look, my tendency is not to see pure success or pure failure, and it's hard to think of one institution that fully lived up to the promise. So obviously, these international organizations, NATO, most important, but the UN, at some level, they maintained the international system of stability that was hoped for. We didn't have a nuclear war. Generally, though there were conflicts and big ones, there was a preservation of stability on the continent, and we avoided a repeat of what happens between 1941 and 1945, and we do prop up democratic governments to some extent. The Marshall Plan fulfills part of what it wants to do. So you can look at that cluster of institutions, and it wasn't perfect because a lot of injustices happen, a lot of bad foreign policy happens under that rubric, and that could be for later in the discussion, but they're pretty good. The presidency and the national security apparatus, we know the long history, a more sordid history. You just look at the Frank Church Committee to see some of what was being done, and we have Vietnam. But I think the apparatus served a purpose, and I think that's coming up front and center right now. That expertise, that kind of force, countervailing force on presidential political incentives was very important in kind of pushing back and providing a good context for trying to make decisions in fraught moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's not a good or bad, but I think you can see both elements with the presidency, and Congress is the most complicated. I mean, at some level, it's easier to say that from 50 on, Congress gradually kept on this issue, on these international issues, delegating a lot of its authority. And I don't totally agree with that, but I think there is an argument of the most dramatic ways in which an institution lost some of what it was supposed to do. That is one. But even there, I mean, Senator Fulbright's hearings in 1966, these hearings about Vietnam were incredibly important in changing the national debate. And we have many moments like that we can also point to. So it's a complicated history.
You mentioned the Church Committee. It seems like, as you said, an ebb and flow.
Yeah.
Push and pull. Stephen, how about you?
Yeah, I'm just going to, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to quote from some prepared remarks that I put together. Unlike the troubled years after the end of the First World War, we as a global community decided not to automatically go back to our old bad habits that had led us to two grievous outcomes, the First and Second World War. In the years since that war, that Second World War, we have had our shares of upheavals and racism and ideological battles and economic collapses. But then today that world and that time was prepared to deal with these issues. The world had generally accepted monitors of global activity, the United Nations, the collective security of democratic nations, NATO, regional alliances, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, refugee organizations, a plethora of UN agencies dealing with health, education, transportation, culture, and human rights, as well as dozens of non-governmental organizations, which were also providing for peoples around the globe. All of them, by the way, operating in the perilous face of the threat of nuclear war. But these were the building blocks that enabled us to reconstruct and renew lives, and more importantly, ward off the outbreak of a third world catastrophe. And today, you have to give credit to those building blocks. At least in the United States, we do have a strong currency today, the most powerful economy on earth, vast partnerships of nations, a strong embrace of multilateralism and joint military action for democratic ends, an openness that has attracted and kept talented people here and not deported them, a leadership in medical research, a society brimming with innovations and technological breakthroughs, the best independent colleges and universities around, a nation that has combined both hard and soft power successfully, and finally, a society that respects the law both internationally and domestically. We did have all those until the advent of the Trump administration, and I'll talk about that later.
All right. One thing I wanted to bring up tonight in this question is the notion of lessons learned. This is something in my job at the State Department, but also teaching at George Washington University, making history relevant. And so what I want to ask of both of you, and Stephen, I'll start with you this time. When you look back from 2025, what lessons from the post-45 moment do you think are most urgent for today's leaders, the kind of key takeaways that they can take from that period and apply it right away to today?
I think collective security. I think it's all about alliances, and right now you have basically the West versus China and Russia, and the only way the West can operate against those two, criminal powers, if I might say, is collectively acting under NATO, under the United Nations, under various regional alliances. And that is the lesson that Roosevelt learned. And one of the reasons why he put into the notion of the United Nations, because he realized the United States could not have won that Second World War without alliances, without allies. Even the Soviet Union at that time was one of our allies. And the US had a choice in 1945. They could have gone on the unilateral route. I mean, they didn't have to organize a security body like the UN. They had the power to pretty much run the world the way they wanted to. But they realized in the end they couldn't survive around the globe in the coming years without having some sort of allies to work with them in order to maintain the peace. And I think that, to me, is that is the biggest lesson that comes out of 45.
I would say lots of lessons. I think collective security is central, and I just add to that a rules-based system, which obviously people will break rules, but maintaining them is central. I think it relates to what we see in American politics, that if you abandon any rules, then you enter a period of chaos. You have to have the conflict happen within some kind of structure. There's a negative. Unfortunately, I mean, it's a little gloomier, but the fragility of the democratic world, it was very apparent in 1945, even after the victory, how quickly this could dissipate, how quickly countries that were democratic at some level could collapse, how quickly the powers of authoritarian fascist governments could gain hold, and it was still living with the Soviet Union. I think for me, that's a very big lesson. It's the Ben Franklin quote, the republic if you can keep it. That was on the minds of everyone, and it still should be today. Do not assume this is how it continues to be. And obviously connected to that is just how horrible humankind can become. And I don't say that lightly. It was front and center when the war ends. The kind of impact of the Holocaust was right there. And, there's a whole set of writers who come out of World War II, theologians, and they're writing all these books in the late 40s and early 50s, existential books that are selling to the public about basically trying to understand, how do you think of something like God after you've just lived through World War II? How do we even imagine a religious kind of outlook given the horrors that had been exposed, let alone the horrors of war itself? And I think that's a lesson we need to remember, not just in terms of war and conflict, but domestically too. We can get into a bad place very quickly. And those are two lessons that I'm thinking about a lot now as we celebrate kind of this anniversary.
You both mentioned collective security. What fascinates me too is I think a lot of Americans assume World War II ends. Of course, Americans, it's just going to be a natural evolution to embrace NATO in 1949 and this notion of collective security. But you go back to the end of World War I and Woodrow Wilson, who arguably drove himself to a stroke, trying to get Congress or pressure Congress by taking train rides around the country because he wanted Article 10 of the League of Nations to be ratified, which would have brought the United States into a collective security agreement, and that never happened. So this was quite a leap in 20 years from that end of World War I to what it's like at the end of World War II and the outlook you both described. I want to just talk a little bit, because this panel is really rooted in a story, and it's the story of the American century, but stories evolve. I'm curious to hear from both of you what narratives about America's post-war legacy do you think have aged well? I think you've touched on some of that, but maybe you could go a little deeper, and ones which deserve to be rewritten or maybe retired entirely in 2025. Julian, you're up.
I'm going to stop and make a quick plug for the work that your office does. I'll reiterate, as a historian, all the questions we're talking about and the kind of work that it's based on depends on the kind of documentation that they've done. And in terms of the State Department, the office has been phenomenal. So I do think it's something worth noting, given everything right now is under attack. The publications are worth looking at, but more importantly, kind of urgent to keep maintaining. Otherwise, these questions are based on speculation as opposed to reading the transcripts. I would say, look, the idea of internationalism, I still think has aged well. It's a little bit of collective security, but it's also just rupturing the idea that we are separated by oceans and that we could fundamentally at some level live on our own. It's not true, and it's become less true with every decade since then. And I think that basic idea that many policymakers were operating on at that point remains as central today as it did then. And the notion it was in our interest to kind of relieve ourselves of some of our power. To be part of a community stands very strong at this point, even if it's under assault and attack. Some of the ideas your father wrote about, I mean, you read them, and they are as relevant today as ever, more relevant. The narrative, look, of American purity. I mean, you can't study the history and not see the underside of a lot of what foreign policy did or accepted. The way in which sometimes policy certainly skewed toward kind of crass interests or allied with the wrong people is part of our history. And for me, the kind of narrative of the greatest generation being used, not to talk about people who were heroic and fought for democracy, but to kind of just characterize us as always that, it just doesn't stand up. And it's actually, not only is it misleading, it pushes us away from really understanding and creating better foreign policy and better politics. And that's a narrative, I think, if you read enough history, it's easy to jettison. And it's actually quite important to have a serious look at a country we love.
Yeah, I might just add that Julian's quite right. You know, the United States has a famous history of being an isolationist nation. All during the 19th century, we operated on a unilateral basis, you know, intervening throughout Latin America and other countries that we were punishing or doing collective debts or whatever the reason was. And that isolationism was so profound that when Woodrow Wilson tried to establish the League of Nations, he automatically there was great resistance, particularly on the side of the Republican Party, which tends to be more isolationist than the Democratic Party, to joining any global organization. And of course, the League, the United States did not join the League, which rendered it basically hollow as a security body. And even when Roosevelt came into power, the sense of that he had to overcome those isolationist forces led by Lindbergh back in the late 1930s, who wanted to have nothing to do with fighting Nazism and just wanted to maintain the kind of oceans that prevented us from having to be linked to either Europe or Asia in terms of the wars going on there. He had to overcome that. And in fact, when he was developing many of his policies, particularly the United Nations, he had to do it secretly in the State Department because he feared that if it ever leaked out that he was working on some new global organization, this would damage his ability to lead the country through the Second World War. And even within the Republican Party, even as the war went on, there was still very strong isolationist tendencies. He had to work very hard to bring a man named Vandenberg, who was one of the biggest foreign policy isolationists in the Republican Party, to bring him aboard for creating the UN as an organization. Eventually, Vandenberg agreed to go to the UN on the UN mission to San Francisco. But even today, that isolationism is reaffirming itself. I mean, what America First is all about isolationism. It's about, we don't want to have to be involved in any treaty organizations. We don't want to have to give our power to any international body. We want to act on our own. We want to be America First, and we want the ability to operate in any country we wish, whether it's a friend or a foe. And in fact, we have a president who's already been talking about invading Greenland and sending troops to Panama to take over the canal, and up until recently, taking over Canada as the 51st state and making Gaza a place for American tourism industry. So this is not something that ever goes away in our history. And you'll see the pattern, and I think Julian's absolutely right, that there's been a ebb and flow in the 80 years that we've been in existence since the Second World War between those isolationist instincts and the multilateral instincts, and they've never been fully resolved. They're never, in my view, ever going to go away. But right now, we are so committed to these international organizations that it's become very difficult for Trump to withdraw very easily from them.
And there was one other narrative, just to add, since we're sitting here at the Harvard Club and educational institutions are under attack, it was part of the narrative coming out of the war, the centrality of not, and we're at your organization, which focuses on these kinds of conversations, that knowledge was going to be central to our collective security. And Vannevar Bush has his famous study he puts out after the war, where he's calling for huge federal investment in sciences, and over time it will be technology as well. But it outlines a story of what will make us great. And strengthening these institutions was going to be crucial to the economy. It was going to be crucial to security. And I think that's remained a really, until recently, a narrative that has held a lot of strength, in part because it's produced good output. And, you know, thinking of this now in 2025, I think it is already under threat. And I think that's something we can remember. In the 1950s, this remains crucial. The National Defense Education Act in 1958 is a response to Sputnik. How do we respond to Sputnik? We pour more money into knowledge, into education. And we need to protect that. And I'm glad more people are, but I think it actually goes back to that moment we're talking about. It's not something recent.
You know, one of the things I'm hearing from both Stephen and from Julian is the nuance, this ebb and flow, whether it's congressional power, whether it's the American psyche when it comes to isolationism. I'm curious to hear from both of you the issue of, is there an inevitability of the Cold War? Here we have the dawn of the American century, but did the Cold War have to happen? I mean, for most Americans, they know Winston Churchill's speech in 1946 in Full, Missouri. The Iron Curtain is descending in Eastern Europe, and then there's a showdown in Iran, and then ultimately we step by step see these cases. I think most students, when they go through school, assume if World War II ends, then the Cold War. But based on what you've seen, how would you what's your perspective when it comes to how this evolved? Was it inevitable? Or was it something that had to happen? And if not, what could have been the alternatives? So let me start with
Well, I mean, there's a famous controversy about this, and people have had strong arguments on both sides. My own feeling is Stalin was paranoid, and that he eventually, once the war was over, he would start to have suspicions of all the allies that had helped Russia and win the Second World War. And I think that once the big reconstruction of Europe came to be and Marshall Plan was put forward, automatically the Soviet Union saw that as a threat. Even though, by the way, the Marshall Plan had been open to them to join, and the feeling of in Stalin, I mean, after all, this was a man who wiped out half his country in the 1930s with all the purges. He was very much of that mindset once he was, you know, in his final years. And frankly, I don't think the United States could have done very much to have stopped his fear of other nations, particularly democratic nations, and particularly the possibility that he might have to give up the countries that he had seized in Eastern Europe. So I don't really think, in my own view, this would have happened anyway under any American president. But Julian may have.
I mean, I remember in graduate school reading all these books, and it's not resolved. So I don't think I'm going to be the one to resolve it. It's also, I mean, I think your arguments are very good, and you know, the recent stuff on Stalin by people like Steve Kotkin, in many ways, I think offer support to what you're saying, but it's a counterfactual which we won't know. So I'm happy to have the debates about how it unfolded and key decisions made within that. I mean, I think there's moments of when things were more contingent, I think, actually, such as with Vietnam, that are easier to see from what we have than the actual broader Cold War itself. But obviously, again, getting back to what we were talking about earlier, we do know the consequences, and we do know the high risks that emerged from the way the superpowers ultimately shaped up with this.
Thank you both. I mean, this is one, again, where this notion of inevitability, as both Stephen and Julian talked about, is one that historians love to go back and forth on. And there's so much nuance that we love to gravitate towards when it comes to, was this just going to happen automatically, or could there have been other turns? A lot of people don't realize that Churchill was criticized for that speech by, including the New York Times. There were those who had come of age in the age of Uncle Joe because Stalin had actually been promoted by the US government. So I appreciate you both trying to take that one on. It's always a very complicated one. I wanted to also ask about presidential leadership, and especially since you've written on this. It's been mythologized, it's been contested, but if you look back from the Truman to Reagan period, this truly the dawn of the American century period, how has the presidency shaped, and at times distorted, our understanding of America's post-war role in the world?
I mean, well, there's one way to answer the question, that we tend to understand the history through the presidencies. That becomes the way we tell the story, and those 4 to 8 year periods are the framework we use, and it's not actually always the best way to understand bigger changes that were happening globally, that were happening within the country, that kind of help understand why we take one path over another, or how we end up in certain conflicts. And it ignores, we tend to really not pay attention to Congress. We tend to often downplay even interests in how this unfolds. But the presidency as an institution has been enormously consequential. I mean, the story of the expansion of executive power only has a break in the 1970s, when there is a response to Nixon, the War Powers Act, the budget reform. But overall, the apparatus has just become enormous, and it has been the arena through which we conducted the Cold War. And I think what we can see in retrospect, I think a lot of historians, certainly the one who wrote The Imperial Presidency, realized in 1973 was the delegation of power was quite serious. That was in large part a result of the Cold War. And what Nixon exposed to many people was, under the wrong hands, that could lead to very bad policy, and it could lead domestically to a lot of dangerous activity. So again, I don't think the imperial presidency was total. I think I can see a lot of ways in which there was pushback, or that framework ignores how other institutions were actually operating. But I do think it's been quite central, and we still have it. I mean, the Cold War ends in 1991, but the imperial or strong executive does not. And in fact, we go through another period of expansion after 2001, and here we are today.
Yeah, I mean, I agree what Julian is talking about. There's always been an ebb and flow between congressional power and the executive power, and that's been throughout our history. But clearly, the period since the end of the Second World War, the flow has been much more towards the executive branch, with a few times like the War Powers Act, which in fact was an attempt, but an ineffectual attempt, to try to bring some control over the presidency. We of course see it most visibly today under Trump, who's trying to press forward on various different ways to expand the authority over immigration and eliminating foreign aid, all these different areas that he's either eliminated or expanded in terms of his own power. And it's really been forced our judiciary to come into play and set the limits on presidential power. It is true that my father wrote the book, The Imperial Presidency, when Nixon was in power. But if he were alive today and saw what has become a true imperial president under Donald Trump, he would be absolutely astonished, because this man has broke so many of the great rules of our society and disregarded the Constitution in many ways. And so we are in a crisis situation because of that. I happen to believe that in the end, the judicial system will show its strength in reining him in. and also his own incompetence. But it is a situation where I think, quite rightly, Congress has had to give up many of its powers in order to allow the presidency to act on a world stage, which was not as true before the Second World War.
And I think, the other thing, just one more point, is we're talking about the institution, but there are really interesting moments of leadership that I think are relevant. And everyone can pick their favorites where the kind of boldness or the vision or the savvy of a president was quite consequential as an individual, meaning it does matter who's in the office. It's not just an institution. And you can, again, pick. Some would pick Jimmy Carter at Camp David and kind of pushing and shoving, essentially, until an agreement was reached. Some would pick Reagan and Gorbachev for those 2 years. Reagan often pushing against his own party to ultimately get that breakthrough INF agreement in 1987. The more you study it, it's really a remarkable set of conversations, and it's complicated how you end up there, but it mattered how he handled it. And it's not simply leadership and getting things done, and I have come to appreciate this more in the last few years, is the norms that leaders, presidents have accepted and abided by. They've obviously become more apparent as someone disregards them. But in terms of how you conduct foreign policy, understanding the risks during the Cold War of doing anything, I think you can really look back at presidents and see those informal rules were so important. And even our most controversial presidents did still get that kind of need to preserve the apparatus and the need to check themselves. And now we can appreciate how crucial that is, in addition to the statutory laws and judicial decisions that we face.
Thank you. I'm going to indulge one more as moderator, and then I promise I'm opening it up to everybody. I'm curious to hear both of you on this, the axiom that domestic politics stops at the water's edge, especially when you look at this early post-war period, 45 to through the 50s at least, if not up to Vietnam. How true is that based on your own research, your own study, that this notion of, well, there's a bipartisan consensus once you get outside the United States and it gets to the foreign policy, especially the early Cold War period, or is that really something that should be revised?
Well, go ahead.
I mean, yes, that's a truism that's been talked about in American history ever since the end of the Second World War, but it's a truism which is broken frequently. And I mean, look at the Vietnam War. I mean, you saw the demonstrations among the American public, divisions in the Democratic Party over the Vietnam War. There's always been resistance to certain foreign policy decisions throughout those 80 years. And they've come in different ways. Obviously, the Church Committee, when it investigated the CIA, was talking about a lot of overseas operations, which we had done secretly. I happened to have written a book about the American coup in Guatemala. I mean, that was a total CIA operation, which was done totally without any knowledge to the American public. And many of these overseas activities that the United States has been involved in have never particularly been well known to the American public because they have been kept secret. And when they do get exposed, you do see a big response against what the U.S. government is doing. So yes, there is bipartisanship, at least up until recently. For example, on NATO or some of the other international organizations we've joined, but I don't see it as outside of big a truism people say. I don't really see it as something that is part of the truth of American history over the last 80 years.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I actually wrote a book years ago, Arsenal of Democracy, which is about that, and it's just not true. I mean, it's not true. There are some areas, obviously, it's not binary where you have bipartisan agreement, or you can argue in a place like NATO, a lot of Americans are not paying attention, it's removed. But over and over again, we fight out foreign policy at some level. We evaluate leadership in elections in an electoral context. Politics informs how leaders often think about what they can or can't do. I mean, you don't have to go very deep into the archive to find this. And it's not always a bad thing. I mean, I don't know if kind of the assumption is always best. There is something good that ultimately even foreign policy has to be subjected to the democratic pressures that this country does well. So I think we're in agreement, though. It's hard to think of a moment when that's a very useful way to think about how the politics work.
Well, I appreciate both of them validating my perspective, because I was a disciple of Mel Small, who talks about this issue going back to the revolution.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to hear both of you in concurrence. All right, now that I've indulged myself on that last one, I do want to open it up. What we can do is have a question from the room. We'll have a mic come to you if you could give your name and your affiliation, but then I'll alternate it with those who may be online asking questions, and we'll go back and forth. So this is the microphone. We have a couple of hands. I'm sorry, we just have the microphone so everybody can hear. Thank you.
Say what you will about Trump. He does believe in American exceptionalism. His implementation isn't probably not the best. What are your thoughts about how the presidency of Trump will evolve, keep going? What's going to happen?
Can I just ask before, just for the sake of the panels, can we just get the name and the affiliation just so?
Absolutely. Stephen Robson, I'm with the Spectator magazine in the UK.
Thank you.
Listen, I think Trump's going to find out that the realities are such that he cannot get everything he wants, and he's finding that out with this tariff struggle. He's going to be bumping up against the solid realities of the world, and I know he has some sort of vision that he wants to carry through, but he simply, just by willpower, can't get it done. A lot of countries will not cooperate with him. And therefore, I think in my own view, I'll give him another couple of months while he plays around with this tariff thing, but I think he's going to find that his powers worldwide are much more limited than he realizes, and that therefore he's going to have to pull back a lot of his policies that revolve around his dramatic economic policy that he's pushing right now. So that's my brief thought about it.
I would say, look, I would add, American exceptionalism is an old ideology. It's pretty fundamental. So most presidents have had a way to think of American exceptional. It's just different how you think what that means. But there's a lot of history written about the power of that idea in this country, often from a critical lens. But he's running against, institutions are in place for a reason, meaning they become institutions because they're needed and often liked. And once you start to dismantle them, you start to see, how the building might shake and how many people are vested in this operating. And I don't mean just kind of secret backroom people, countries and stability. And I think he's going to encounter more problems. I think the more he's doing this, the more turbulence there is certainly in the world and in the electorate about his effects. But that does not downplay the impact he can have. I think I don't think it's easy to undo with the tariffs, even if he got rid of them all tomorrow. It's now there, or the severed relationships with allies, kind of almost launching a virtual war with Canada. It's not instantly forgotten. And that is the nature of relationship, is commitment and predictability. And if you lose that, it's hard. So there'll be a lot of work after this if someone wants to kind of reverse or tamper some of what he's done. It's going to be a lot of work.
I want to just please be fair to the virtual folks in the room. So please, anybody online, I know we have a question coming in.
Or rhetoric in today's political discourse around China and Russia?
I mean, yeah, you have just rhetoric around a fierce, dangerous competitor, an adversary who poses an existential threat. It's still very different. Certainly with China, it's so complicated, the economic ties we have with China. It's very different than the Soviet Union. We are totally, at some level, integrated with our adversary. And even at this point, the military threat is very different than when we thought and spoke of a Cold War with the Soviet Union, where the kind of real issue was nuclear war in many ways. That was the fundamental we were talking, would it happen or not? Here, it's still a lot about economic competition and power at the same time that we're integrated. In Russia, you see some of that, but Russia is not the Soviet Union. I mean, it's a threat, and I think all the problems it's now creating as a result of Ukraine and its efforts to expand its reach, but it isn't China. And so I think that's important to remember.
I would add that I don't think ideology is important anymore. I mean, we all know that China pretends to be a communist nation. It's turned into another basically Western-oriented economy, as far as I can see. And but it's dictatorships, I think, that we now think about. Because after all, the Soviet Union's a dictatorship, and it's true in China. I think that issue between freedom and dictatorship is the kind of wording I would use today. The Cold War did suggest, as Julian was saying, it was the old Soviet Union notion and the nuclear war showdown that we were all talking about. But China is totally integrated with our economy. They're totally dependent on us. We're very much dependent on them. This is not a issue between ideologies anymore. To me, it's really dictatorships versus free economies, free governments, and ones that's where you get the passions that people feel today.
I'm going to turn to our microphone team, and they get to choose who the lucky contestant is, because I can't see who had their hands up first. And again, please, if you could just do name and affiliation for the sake of the panel.
Good evening. My name is Rick Weaver. My affiliation is I'm a graduate of Georgetown University. First, thank you. It's an honor to be in your presence. 30 years ago, in a similar audience, I had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Schlesinger give a lecture based on his foreign affairs work titled Back to the Wound, Isolationisms of Renewed Threat. Without going into too much details, because I know we want to be brief here, the basic premise of his argument was that it's actually in America's core DNA, this isolationist tendency, and it's interrupted during times when we feel threatened, and hence the institutions, Bretton Woods, that the government, the United States, set up to lock us into these international commitments so that we would not go back. That was the intent. Yep. With that background, I was wondering if you can comment on whether or not in 2025, 30 years later after that work, is that still a fair way of thinking about it, that the United States' natural tendency is to be isolationist?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Remember, both President Washington and President Jefferson were warning against being entangled with foreign countries in any kind of network or confederation. It was, we can live alone. We have two great oceans to protect us. We don't need anybody else to help us. And we want to act unilaterally. And it wasn't until the First World War that was broken by Wilson. And even then, there was tremendous resistance against him in doing that. The idea of sending troops to Europe, I mean, that was considered weird. And that's why by the time the Second World War had rolled on, we'd gone back into an isolationist period, both in the 20s and 30s. It took Roosevelt's deviousness, which, because he was politically attuned, he could figure out ways of getting us back involved in a second go-round of war, but he had to do it very quietly and very, very silently, and he had to be very careful about how he did it. And I think Trump is reflective of that very basic instinct to withdraw and to go forward alone without any entanglements, without having to depend on allies, and think that we're rich enough, wealthy enough, and powerful enough to do it all on our own. I think he's totally wrong, but I think that is part of the equation right now in our politics.
I think the article and how you described it obviously holds up pretty well. If you didn't tell me when it was written, I could imagine it was written recently. I would just add two things. I mean, there is also a powerful internationalist strand in American life since the founding. We were always cognizant of ourselves being part of the world, literally from the revolution, where we saw the relations overseas. The 19th century was not as completely isolationist as we often imagine. Even once we have steamships, we're involved in travel and trade, and so I think there's this. It's a contest, and I don't think it's just institutions that maintain that internationalist perspective. I also think it's part of our DNA, and it's certainly become stronger. And I think this generation now that's coming of age is going to see the world differently. I mean, communication has fundamentally altered the way we see the world, and younger people are just much more exposed to themselves as global citizens at some level. I think it's going to have an effect. And then the economy, it's also a myth that we're only now a kind of global economy. People made that argument in the 19th century already. But it's becoming even more pronounced. Everything's bits and pieces from all over the world. And so I think those two will amplify the internationalist elements. Again, none of that is to discount. I think actually he's 100% right. That's a powerful pulse, but there is the rest of it. And I don't think we should forget it. And I think that's what proponents of internationalism have to build on.
We just, can I get to is the virtual chat? Okay. We're good.
Hi, I'm Caleb Simmons, Alumni Ventures. Mr. Zelizer, this economic entanglement you speak of between the U.S. and China and really the entire Atlanticist order, given the nature and scope of these tariffs that we're seeing coming out and the effects taking hold, beginning to, given how dense this economic state is, do you see any extent of damage, even medium term or long term, and how permanent or irreparable do you see that being?
Every time I meet an economist, that's what I'm now asking. Like, not simply what you said, but I'm like, are there economists who are arguing the opposite? And it's really remarkable. Wide range of economists, from conservatives to more liberal. No one can say there's that many who are confident this is a good path forward, and just the opposite. And so I'm not an economist, but it's notable how strong that consensus is. It seems, that the kind of engaging in a trade war historically is just not a great idea, especially at this level, meaning as opposed to targeted tariffs. So there's the history that goes against it. It does go against the nature of the economy, where we are dependent on the people we are now taxing. And it doesn't mean you can't, again, focus on certain areas where things are not in a good state. And a lot of people do agree with China, some kind of tariffs are good. But this blanket tariff regime seems to contradict the structure of the economy. Third, it's premised on something that's not going to happen. It's all premised, if you listen to President Trump's words, on restoring a 1940s and 50s manufacturing economy. No one is saying that really can happen. A lot of the factories will have robots. AI is going to have a huge effect. And in fact, as the tariff regime is taking place, and here I think Tom Friedman has actually been very good. He is knocking out the pillars of what we need to really be competitive. All sorts of knowledge-based investments are being dismantled. So it doesn't really, as China is ramping them up at this very moment. And finally, it's the way we're doing the tariffs. It's not only that they're blanket, they're haphazard, it's chaos. And that is not a good way to kind of either create fear or confidence among adversaries or allies. And so I think there's sound arguments. Again, this is not my expertise, but certainly I've heard enough now and read enough that it doesn't really, make sense what he has done. And it seems like it could be pretty, if we go into a recession when we didn't have to. It's not the Depression. It's not when Hoover takes over in a difficult economy and does the wrong thing. This is triggered by the president. And I think that's quite notable historically.
I might add, you remember Warren Buffett said the other day that the tariff is a kind of warfare, and particularly a blanket tariff, the way Trump has presented it. And in fact, everything that Julian was talking about and other people, economists have talked about, it doesn't fit the situation. It's a total kind of dream that Trump has that somehow we're being screwed by the rest of the world, and the only way to get back at them is to force upon them these unfair, from their point of view, unfair tariffs, literally without any coherence. It's simply blanket. It's every country right now, every country, including the little island with the penguins on it, has to pay 10%. And I know that they're now proclaiming that they've finally gotten Great Britain to agree to some sort of deal, but even there it's going to be another 6 or 7 months before that deal is concluded. This idea that it was going to happen just like that is foolish, and it's really damaged our economy. The Biden economy, if he just left it alone, he would have been in a great situation. But now he's so splintered it and so roiled it that we're in a much more difficult situation economically, and he hasn't really produced what he claimed, that he was going to have 90 countries were going to sign on in 90 days. He has possibly one country at this point. It's been a colossal error on his part.
Now, unfortunately, my job as moderator means that I have to be the one who stops and squelches the rest of the conversation, but we've hit the mark. I want to take a moment to thank Julian Zelizer, Stephen Schlesinger for all that they've done here tonight.
Thank you.